So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on saving time with Dataflow Automation. My name is Barrett Johannesson and I'll be your host today, and I'll be fielding the questions for our great presenter, Jonathan Su. At this point, let's go through some of the announcements that we have within the Zerion world. So first and foremost, we have our next certification session on June 20th, 21st, and 22nd. We already have a good amount of people signed up, so if you're interested, please make sure you sign up so that you do not lose a seat. The links to that sign up can be found within the PDF that John shares with you, but also on ZerionSoftware.com in the resources section, you'll see an area that says Get Certified. In addition to the FormBuilder certification, we have recertification. Now, for those of you who've participated in the FormBuilder certification, you may not think that you want to get recertified, or you don't think that you need a review because you've been using the platform so much. But I really do urge you to go through that recertification, because not only do we go through the new FormBuilder interface, but we also go into building your knowledge with FormBuilder, building your knowledge within form building and adding things like page level JavaScript. So that next session will be on August 20th, 29th, and 31st. The next announcement is, you may have heard that we are going to retire the classic form builder in June. That is being pushed back a little bit right now because we have found some different things that we want to fix before we actually put that classic builder into retirement. So be on the lookout for some emails notifying you about that date. There should be a couple coming through in the next couple days. Next up in our upcoming webinars, we have Solving Business Problems with Zerion Web Services. This is going to be done by John and our colleague Ryan, and they'll be going into just the different problems that a lot of businesses face and how you can actually solve those with our services. And then on the 28th, we have our Spotlight on Customer Solutions. So at the end of today's webinar and tomorrow, you'll actually receive a follow-up email with a survey included. One of the questions in that survey is if you are interested in presenting your customer solution. So please make sure you fill that out and let us know that that is something that you are interested in. We have 2 or 3 presenters during each webinar. And so we have some people from the last time we did it. We have their names, and we just want to add some more people and try to have more of these solution webinars as time goes on. And the last thing I want to make sure that you're aware of is on July 6th, we'll be doing our normal Tony webinar, which in that Tony webinar, we go through what's happened so far in 2017 and what you can expect in the near future. So before I hand this over to John and he starts going through everything, I do want to launch a couple polls here. The first poll I'm going to launch is our normal one, just asking if you're a current user. So if everyone could go ahead and fill that out, that would be great. Wonderful. So almost 100% have responded, and it looks like most people are currently iFormBuilder users, but we do have about 25% who are also Zerion users and 8% who are neither. So I'm going to close that poll and launch another one before I hand this over. So this is more applicable to what we're actually discussing today. And this is multi-select. So if you could go ahead and choose one or more of the following, and share with us which of these processes do you currently do manually. For some of you, you may find that it's all of those processes, and some others of you may only have 1 or 2 of those. All right, so we have a lot of information coming in here, John, and we're just going to wait for a couple more responses here. But it's really looking like all of these processes are done manually, except for the checking the individual integrations when something breaks. That's the only one that doesn't have any responses yet. But the other ones are pretty even, with the import data into spreadsheet software having the most responses. And I think that makes a lot of sense in what we've seen in the past as well. So I'll go ahead and close this poll. And John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Barrett, and good afternoon, everyone, or I guess good evening or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. So I'm really happy to present this webinar to you all today about saving time with Dataflow Automation. For those of you who are Zerion customers, you are already aware of Dataflow Automation as one of the services that's included under the Zerion Web Services umbrella. For those iFormBuilder users, I did want to give you a brief introduction about Dataflow Automation. It's one of the services that we offer, and it works really as like a central cog in terms of taking your data collection and then it being able to connect your data collection to a variety of different other services. And then what we're going to be doing today is we'll start off by going into Dataflow Automation a little bit deeper. So I'll present it as a topic, especially for those of us who are new to the concept or who may not be familiar with the service. I'll do a brief introduction about what it is and go over some basic terminology so that we should be able to stay together during the rest of the webinar. After that, I'm going to go through 3 different data flows that I've built out for everyone. These are actually data flows that I use currently, and what I did was I stripped away portions of them so that I can then rebuild them for you. Talk about some of the things that they do, talk about the advantages and the challenges that are solved using these data flows. And a lot of the challenges and solutions are going to pertain to that multi-select question Barrett just launched earlier. So as we move forward, let's start by talking about Dataflow Automation. Now, the way I like to describe Dataflow Automation is I like to call it a mapping of instructions that is responsible for handling the acceptance, refinement, and distribution of data. So if you look down below, I have a screenshot of a data flow that I've built before. And think of this screenshot or this image as like a map, and it's going to be your guide with instructions along the way of what to do with your data. Now there's 3 primary functions that I mentioned, accepting, refining, and distributing data. Each one of them is color-coded based on the Dataflow object that you see. So each object is going to be a circle along this path. Now the path does have a direction to it. It will always move from left to right across the data flow. So we start on the left-hand side, and then we'll work our way towards the right. Now a couple of things that you may notice, we normally start with this teal-colored object. This one in particular is called a webhook. For those of you who've worked with integrations in the past, you may be familiar with that term. Think of this as a mailing address for the data flow. It's a way of sending data into my data flow. All of these blue objects here are going to be called record sets. Now, on this slide, I have refine as the primary function of them, because normally what you're going to be doing is you're going to be making changes to the data. But the other thing you can do is if you see this record set here has no letter over it, record sets are also responsible for the storing of data inside of a data flow. So my data is stored at each one of these stops along the way. There's data here, 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 and here. Now, as my data goes through the data flow, each one of these record sets can apply what's called a data refinement technique. Now, there's 3 primary ways to refine your data. That is filtering, transforming, and aggregating. Now, I'm going to go through all 3 of these real briefly, but just know that for this webinar, we're only going to be focusing on the first 2, filtering and transforming. So when you want to filter data, you're basically taking each record and you're going to apply a set of rules that say whether that record is allowed in the record set or not. So if, for example, you have a record set where you have a filter that's going to only allow records in from a certain user, you can write that and establish those rules. If that user is the person who submitted the record, then that record will be allowed into the record set and it will continue along the path. If that condition fails, the record will not be allowed, and then along that branch of the data flow, that part is effectively ended at that point. Now, the second type of refinement is a transformation or a transform. Now, when you're transforming data, you're not saying whether it's allowed in the record set or not allowed in. What you're going to say is that the record set, the record has made it into the record set, and it's now going to be changed fundamentally. Now, there's 3 main ways that you can change a record. You're able to add to it, you can modify it, so you can edit properties that already exist, or you're able to delete from it. Think of this as an example. You may be able to change the format of a date, or you may want to add a property to that record based on other values. And then finally, you may want to strip away portions of the record. For example, you may want to remove metadata from the record because you won't need it in a reports table. The final refinement technique is going to be an aggregation. And an aggregation is looking not at an individual record in the record set, but you're looking at all of the records within the set as a whole. You'll then be deriving values such as the count or a sum or an average, but you're taking a look at the data as a whole. It's an aggregation because we're creating data, new data, from the entire set of records. Now finally, the last function of a data flow is going to be to distribute data. So after we've accepted it, we've stored and refined it, the last thing we want to do is send it somewhere else. So that's why I described data flow earlier as being a central cog. It's not normally the ending place of your data. It's really the middle piece. So from your data collection, your data flow then handles the middleware and then sends it somewhere else after it's been refined properly. These yellow icons you see are called action objects. And an action object is going to be responsible for sending that data to another service. In the case of this screenshot here that I have, this icon specifically is for a reports action, so that would be sending it to a dashboarding software that we offer. You could create a PDF document, or you could send out an email. Now, normally when we're working within a data flow, that distribution is going to be to an external service, and so oftentimes you'll have to create credentials and establish the authentication for those, but we're not going to be talking about that today. I just wanted to introduce it very briefly. Now, before I move forward and start talking about the individual data flow examples, Barrett, I did want to take a second here to see if there are any questions that have been asked or if there's anything that could clarify.
At this time, our audience has been kind of quiet, so hopefully they'll have some more questions coming up soon.
Sounds good. And I do want to say that I know that data flows being probably a newer topic for a lot of people, this can be a lot of information early on. What I urge everyone to do is to think about ways that you have to manipulate your data manually in your current situation and how you could make your life easier in that respect. And so that was why we had the poll earlier. If you're doing things like manually importing records into a spreadsheeting software, or you're having to manually reassign records to users because they didn't fill it out correctly, these are all processes that can be automated with a data flow. So I handled a lot of the discussion around the objects and how it's shaped and how it moves. But the one critical piece that I failed to mention earlier was that once you have this data flow set up, the intention is that it runs automatically. So if you think about every time a record is submitted and it enters the data flow, it will run through the data flow without needing to be prompted. And then that could then automate the process of importing records into a spreadsheet or reassigning a record to a user. Also, all of those transformations and filters that you'll do to your data will be automated as well. So after you have it set up, I like to think of it as like a set it and forget it. You put it in place and then you leave it to do its work. So let's go ahead and start moving through the different use cases, the example data flows I built out for everyone today. The first one is going to focus on monitoring multiple action objects. Now, I know that in the poll, not a lot of people, actually no one, checked the option saying that they have to manually check on their integrations when something breaks. That's a good thing. A lot of the times that's because when an integration breaks, it's going to send you some sort of an error message. In the case of a data flow, and if you think back to the drawing I had before, you're able to branch and have multiple actions set up in a single data flow. So one record can really spawn, 3, 4, 5, a large number of action requests. Now, to monitor each one of those action requests can become very tiresome. It can also become very time consuming. Normally what will happen is you'll find some sort of an error, whether it's in a calculation on a reports table or a document didn't come out quite the way you expected it to. And it can be difficult to start tracing back through your data flow to find the source of the problem. Now, the solution I have for us to overcome this obstacle is to use what are called event objects. And once you set up your event object, you're able to create an all-in-one monitoring solution for your action objects within a specific data flow. Now, Barry, I did notice there was a question asked. Did you want me to address the question now, or should I jump right into the data flow itself?
Go ahead in the data flow.
Okay. So let me go into my Dataflow Automation service. And I'm going to go ahead and load up the data flow that I have prepared for us. So what you'll see here is a very basic data flow, except that it branches quite a bit. And so you'll see at the end here, I have 4 different action objects. And if something's not going to go correctly, it's difficult for me to tell which one of those actions is responsible for the failure. I could click here and check for my recent errors for each one of them, but then I would have to do things like check on the date to see if it's, if it was recent, and that can be very time consuming. What we're going to do is we're going to create what's called an event, and that event is going to handle notifying me of any errors that happen within this data flow. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to add a record set for any sort of a failed event, right? So we're going to call this failed records. Now you'll notice that this record set is not connected to my path up here yet, and that's okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add an event, and I'm going to call this failure. Now what an event object is it's similar to a webhook because you'll notice the colors are the same. What an event does is it triggers, or it's the beginning point of a new flow inside of my data flow, so it starts its own path. And the idea here is that each action is able to have one of 2 outcomes. So if you're trying to do something, it could resolve in one of 2 ways. It could either be successful or it could be unsuccessful. The way we describe this in Dataflow Automation is you can have a success acknowledgement, or you could have a failure. And so what we'll do is we're going to choose an existing event. So in the case that this action fails, we're going to send data to this event here called failure. And then let me go ahead and save this. Now what I can do is, if we take a look back here, from this drop-down menu when I selected it, okay, all I have to do is take that and apply the exact same event to each one of these different objects. And by doing this, if any one of these objects fails, it will trigger that event, and it will store the triggered response in that record set that I made. Now, the question is, what type of information am I going to get here? You get a lot of really pertinent information that's going to help you track down the source of your problem. So the first thing you're going to see is the name of my data flow. You'll also know which action it came from. So this way I don't have to check every single action. I'll be able to know from the notification exactly what I'm getting. I'll also be able to get the actual record information, so the data itself, as well as any sort of an error message that may have occurred when the record failed. Let me go ahead and save this. So now I have my actions. Upon failure, each one of them would trigger this event, which would then store the response inside of this record set. Now, having the response stored here is nice in terms of keeping a log. However, that's not going to be very useful when it comes to being notified about something happening. So what I want to do is, off of this record set, I'm actually going to add an email action. So here I'm going to name my email action. I'm going to say error notification. This is that connection I was talking about earlier. I've already authenticated with this email server, so I've already given it my credentials. For my email options, I'm able to say who this email is coming from. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to take the value inside the record and use the email address, which was one of the fields in my form. I'm going to send this to myself so that I will be notified. And the subject is going to be, we can say Dataflow error, and I'm going to use the name of my data flow, so tracker v2. In the template, I'm able to say there was an error with this data flow. Please see response below. And then I will include my record down below. So this is going to be a placeholder or a mapping of the actual record that's being sent through. I can go ahead and save this. And then I'm trying to think of how I can actually make this error out that I would send down here. What I can do actually instead is I'm going to go ahead and make a success event. Save this very quickly. And now you'll see that was made underneath. So now if I were to manually rerun one of these records, this action of rerunning it basically means from here it's going to continue the path. It'll automatically, or not automatically, manually trigger the execution of the data flow. This action can resolve as either being successful or unsuccessful, and we'll see down here I have one record in my success record set. If I take a look at this, you'll see this is the information that I have, where I have the record set name, the data flow name, and then the status was that it passed. Now in the event that it had failed, it would have followed this event path, and then I would have been emailed that error notification. All right, Bear, are there any questions real quickly?
There was a question that I think would be helpful for everyone else to hear as well.
Sure.
This question is about the records that fail. They say, so the records that failed, will they be stored in the failed records and not in storage, or would they be in both?
That's a really good question. So the record would be in both. So if you want to think about having this path here, a record that is here and that continues on here leaves its footprint here. So you would still see it stored in the original record set. Then if it had, say, a transformation or some sort of a filter applied to it, the modified version of that record would then be stored here. Now the one thing I will make note of is that from here to here, by going through the event, the record is modified slightly. You'll see that I sent through this first record here. And so you'll see there's all this information like the ID, the entry type, as well as some certain values down below. But inside of this, I get more metadata actually. So I get information about the data flow, the action, where it came from, and then the status that it passed. So you will get slightly different data. In the event of a fail, you would also get like the full data associated with it as well. Any other questions?
That's it for now. But for everyone else listening, please keep those questions coming.
All right, so let's do a real quick recap of this. So I do have a short diagram here highlighting kind of the important points of this data flow that we just made. So we'll start in the upper left here, right? Again, this teal colored object is called a webhook, and that's going to be responsible for any time iFormBuilder or data collector records are submitted into the data flow. As the data moves through into my different actions, understand that an action can have one of two outcomes. It could either be successful or it could be a fail, unsuccessful. Now what we did inside of our data flow is we set all four of these actions to trigger an event called failure if the action is unsuccessful. So then what you have down below is that event with the name as an identifier. Any records that fail are going to be stored in this record set here, and as it continues to flow left to right, the data would then be sent to a predetermined email address. And again, I do want to reiterate, this is actually a data flow that I use on a daily basis. And I have this set up this way so that if something does not work properly, I know and I will get notified immediately. All right. Any last questions before I move on to the next data flow, Barrett?
Nope, except do you want me to launch the first data flow one, or how do you want me to do that for the polls?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that actually in between these. That would be awesome.
Okay, so if everyone could take a second and just quickly respond here to share with John how useful you think that example was for your workflows. All right, so we're getting a lot of positive responses. It looks like people are varying between somewhat useful and useful. So that is great. So I'll go ahead and close this poll and hand it back to you, John.
Thank you. All right, so moving on down to our second data flow. This data flow is going to be focused on maintaining a level of integrity with our data between data collector or iFormBuilder and then reports as well. So let me set up the scenario for us, everyone here. The idea here is that once you collect data in iFormBuilder or in Zerion Data Collector, you have that data stored, and we call that the point of origin, where the data was originally collected. Now, assuming that that goes through a data flow and it goes into reports, so like some sort of a spreadsheeting software, we know that a lot of companies, because we've heard this feedback before, they'll make changes on, say, the Excel file. But then what happens is you run into an issue where you now have two different sets of data that don't match up. So the best practice is always going to be to make changes to the data at the point of origin if possible. Now the question is, if I make a change on Data Collector or an iFormBuilder, how is that going to affect my spreadsheeting software? Now obviously we don't want to have that discrepancy in the data, so what I've done is I've created a data flow where whether I insert, update, or delete a record in Data Collector or an iFormBuilder, that same change is going to be reflected in my spreadsheeting software, in this case, Zerion Reports. What we'll need to do is we'll need to create a data flow that has two paths. Now the paths are fundamentally split between the first one being for any record that is created or updated, and the second path is going to be reserved for any time a record is deleted. So I'm going to jump into my second data flow here. And now, just like I had with the other one, part of this is already built out. And I'm going to complete the building process to show everyone how this works. Now what I have here is I have two webhooks. This first path at the top is going to be responsible for adding data into my reports table. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up another tab, and we're going to go into Data Collector and show you how we set all of this up and connect everything. All right, so what we're going to be doing first is we're going to be creating what's called an endpoint or post data inside of our form. So I'm going to go under Forms and go to Assignment. I'm going to find my form, click on Assign, and down here under Post Data, I'm going to have to create two endpoints, one for each of those webhooks. Now the first one I want to do is I'm going to do this insert here. And so what I'll do is I'll click on New Endpoint, and I'm going to say Data Flow Insert Update. Let me go ahead and grab the webhook URL. This is that long address I was talking about earlier. Copy this to my clipboard and paste it in as the endpoint URL. Now, under this mode, you'll see there's an insert update as well as a delete, and this is why I was saying that it's fundamentally split between these two actions. Now, after I create this endpoint, I can click on Create, and now I'm going to need to make a second endpoint for the delete. For this endpoint URL, I'm going to grab the other webhook, copy it, and paste it over, and I'm going to set my mode to delete. So now what this means is this endpoint is only going to trigger if a record is deleted. The other endpoint would trigger if a record were to be inserted or to be updated. Now to see this in action, what we're going to do is we'll go over to Data, and let's search for this form. And now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to edit this record. And let's say we go ahead and put in a different value here. Let's make this 100. Actually, that number doesn't make sense. We'll say 70. Save. So by editing this record inside of my data flow, you'll see that this path executed. I just got a new record here. This used to be 5 and now it's 6. If I go to record data, I can see that this record here exists where I have my lat 1, long 1 as 70 and 70. This is going to send to reports. Now, over here with my reports action, and actually I can open another tab and show that to you as well. The way this works is I have this action set to either update or insert. Now, if I had chosen add a single row, every time I make an update to a record, it would treat that as a brand new row inside of my spreadsheet or inside of my table, and that's not what I want. What I want is anytime I make an update, it's going to take that original record and it's going to update it on the table. Again, going back to that idea of having data integrity between our data collection point, our point of origin, and then also the actual reports tool, so our spreadsheet software. Now what I need is a set of criteria in order to determine whether I'm doing an update or I'm doing an insert. And the criteria we have established is that if my record's ID matches an ID of a row inside of my table, that means I've already submitted that record before, because an ID always has to be unique. And so I'm going to do an update. In the event that ID is not found, then I'm able to say that I know it's a new record, and I'll do an insert. And so that's how this logic works. Down below, you'll see I have all of these mapped out to one another. So on the left-hand side is my table names, so the table column names. On the right-hand side, these are the different properties within my record. So I'm mapping data values to each of these columns. And at the very bottom, I have my reports criteria. This is, again, the column name ID is equal to the property record.id. So if they match, then we're going to do an update. Now if I open up this table here, you'll see I had this original record here and then this record down below. And if I scroll over here, I see the 70 is up here, and it didn't add it as a new row. So if I were to make a change here one more time, edit this again, and let's make these negative 70. I save this. First thing I'll show, this number increments up to 7. Now over here in reports, you'll see that I don't have a new row here. Oh, these are set to being positive. This may not, hold on a second. Let me change my data type here. So that I'm able to accept the values correctly. And while I go through this, Barrett, are there any quick questions?
No, I mean, I think everyone's taking it all in, and as you mentioned before, it is a lot of information. But I think so far the questions that have been coming in are great, and I've responded to them. And I just urge everyone to just keep throwing those questions in, or if we've lost you at any point, just let us know where we've lost you, and we can pick up where that was.
Yeah. All right, so what I did was I changed the data types of my table columns so that they should accept the negative numbers, hopefully. And then what I'm doing is I'm rerunning that last record through into this reports action. Now, if I refresh this, okay, let's take a look. There we go. Now you see the change has been reflected, negative 70, and we don't have a new record added. So this was effectively an update. If I were to add a new record, so if I go back here and I create a new record, we'll just pick a simple number here. Save this. So you'll see that this record has an ID of 9. Because 9 did not exist in the table before, when I refresh, you'll see that it's a new row set here. Now, the next part to setting up this data flow is finishing up this bottom path. So if I delete a record, what's going to happen? So let me go ahead and delete that record I just made. We'll delete the selected record, confirm. You'll see it's no longer available on data collector. In my data flow, this number is 3 originally. When I refresh, you'll see this is now a 4. So over here, if I go to my record data, let's take a look at what this looks like. You'll notice that the data is very short. It's only going to give me the ID value, but that's all I need in order to do the delete itself. So once I have that ID, I need to make my new action to reports. I'm going to choose my database and I'm going to find my table. Oops. Don't want to create it. I want to search for it. Now inside this table, what I want to do is I'm going to do a delete. And then it's going to give me a criteria. Now, any records that match this criteria are going to be deleted, so you want to be very careful. I'm actually going to use the exact same criteria I used before, where ID is equal to record.id. I'm going to save this, and I can rerun that last record that went through. And if we go into reports and I refresh, you'll see that record has been deleted. So now that we've created that link, let's show how it will work all the way through. If I take a record over here and I delete it, that same change is shown on my reports table. So this is how you're able to set up that equivalency, so any changes you make in data collector or an iFormBuilder are going to be shown on your dashboarding software. Now, some recaps about this data flow that I just built out. We had 2 webhooks. The top one is going to be responsible for when records are inserted or updated. And again, we set up that mode inside of data collector or inside of iFormBuilder to determine how that post data would function. The bottom one is going to be responsible for when records are deleted. Now you're going to go straight through this data flow. Over here, my action type was set to update or insert, and the criteria used is the column ID should match the value of record.id. Similarly, for my delete, my action type would be a delete instead of an update insert, but my criteria is still going to be the same. ID is equal to record.id. All right. Barrett, are there any questions? And also at the same time, if you want to launch that second poll for this data flow, that would be great.
Sure, I've just launched the poll and no other questions since we last talked through it.
Okay.
So we'll just wait a second here for some additional responses. What I'm seeing is kind of the same pattern that we saw before. No one's saying that it's not useful at all. No one's saying that it's very useful. It's right smack in the middle with somewhat useful and useful.
Okay.
Which are both great responses.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and close this poll again to allow you to continue.
All right, thank you. So our third data flow is going to be focusing on validating and reassigning records. Based on one of the first polls that we did, I think that this one is going to be pertinent to a lot of people's workflows currently. So I'm glad that I saved this one for last. Now the idea here, or our challenge, is that the process of manually reviewing a record can be very time consuming. On top of being time consuming, it really is a problem because it causes people to have to wait on one another. So if you're thinking about a situation where you have a field inspector and he submits his record for review, he has to wait to see if that supervisor is going to reassign it back to him. In that time, it's either dead time where they're waiting around, or that's time that they could have been spent doing other things. Now, if the process of evaluating the record can be standardized, meaning that there is a set of criteria that you have to follow to make sure that it's correct, then you should also automate that process as well. Our solution to this is to use Dataflow Automation to validate a record's contents. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going through a data transformation and checking the contents of a record to see how well it does. Now, if that record fails, meaning that it was not sufficient, then we should reassign it to the user and then alert them as well. For those of you who have experience working with iForm and iFormBuilder and Data Collector, you do have that ability to take a record that already exists, that's been created already, and assign it to a user, meaning that it would be downloaded to their device, and they would then be able to take that record, modify it, and resubmit it. Now, the one downside to that is in terms of notifications, you do get a notification on your mobile device that a record has been assigned to you. However, sometimes you don't have your device readily on hand, you're not looking at it immediately, and so you may want to have an email notification as well, letting you know that a record has been assigned to you. And so I took that into account as well in this data flow and accomplished both of those. So for my third data flow, let me go ahead and open this one up. Now what I want to do is I want to give you an idea of what type of data this looks like to begin with. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go over here to my data collector. And these records are very simple actually. So all I did was I am simulating having like a true-false test. Think of like a quiz. In this context, it was like a certification quiz. And if they don't receive a passing score, we want to reassign it to them so that they can try again. So I'm going to put in some information here. And we're just going to say all of these responses are false, which is not true. Let me save this. Okay. And so now that data comes into my record set. You'll see the number is set to 2. Now what I'm going to do is under my data refinery, I'm going to take a look at my filter to see how this data looks. Now under my sample data, this is going to be what the record looks like originally. You'll see I have Q1 through 4, they're all false. And then I have my metadata up above. Now inside of my config here, I'm able to define what's called a custom transformation. Now, I know that this may be a lot to look at. I'll talk through the code. It's actually not too bad. It goes through a very simple process, and I can explain it to you. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that, no correct answers and no questions have been checked. So 0 and 0. The next thing I do is define an answer key. So for question 1, the answer is false. For questions 2, 3, and 4, the answers are true. Then if we jump down here, all I'm doing is for every question in my answer key, I'm going to compare it to my original record, which is this letter R. So that's my sample data. If the values match, that means it was correct. So let's add 1 to my count of correct answers. Now, whether it's correct or incorrect, we're always going to increment count because we just checked another question inside of my answer key. At the end of this, we're going to add 2 new properties to our record. We're going to add a property called correct, which is equal to this number, and then a property called count, equal to this number. And this here is an example of one of those transformation types I was telling you about, where we're adding properties to an object. What we can do is we can preview this real quickly. And you'll see that from the sample data to now here, we have these 2 new properties. Correct, I had 1 correct, which was this question number 1, and 4 questions total. So from these 2 values, I would then be able to calculate a score later on if I want. So let me save this. The next thing we need to do is we need to determine if we want to reassign this to a user. So to do that, I'm going to go under my forms, data collector record. I'm going to call this reassign record, and for my action, I'm going to choose to assign the record. Now what I'm able to do here is I'm able to search for the page. And you'll see here how this page is page ID 473. This is going to be important. Now down below here, I'm able to set up a record ID. So I can say record.id. So I'll assign this current record out. But over here, I get a drop-down menu. So this is going to make me choose a specific user. Now this can be really helpful if you're always sending records to one user, for example, like an administrator. But in our context of this challenge, we want to send the record back to the person who submitted it. In order to accomplish that, I'm going to have to use this dynamic mapping option. You'll see the page IDs remaining here, but down below now, I'm able to dynamically assign a record to the user. And so what I want to do is I'm going to use record.createdBy. And again, this is a piece of metadata from our form that's collected. And so now this record would be reassigned to that user. Now if I save this as is, this will happen every time. So it would take this record and reassign it to that user no matter what. That's not what we want to have happen though. We only want to have this reassigned if their score is lower than a certain threshold. So what we can do is set up a condition on my action. A condition is very similar to a filter. For those of you who are familiar with form building, a condition is going to be very similar to a condition value, where if it's true, then it works and it happens. In the case of a condition value, it's shown. If it's false, it will not happen, or it would be hidden. For my condition, I'm going to say record.correct divided by record.count is less than 0.75. So the idea here is if they got lower than a 75% on their certification test, that would be true, and then this would send out that record to be reassigned to them. So if I save this, what I can do here next is actually I'm going to add my second action, an email action. I'll say alert user. I'll use this email connection from, we'll send this from ourselves, training at zerionsoftware.com to record.email, which was a property inside of my object, subject, will be a little callous in my subject line. And then for the template, we can just type a body here. We'll say, please try your certification test again. Your score was below the minimum threshold. Thank you. And we're going to want to apply a similar condition to this as well. We don't want to notify them every time. We only want to notify them if their score was too low. I can save this. And now if I rerun a record here, manually rerun, I want to run it not just to one branch or the other branch. I want to run it to all branches. I'll run a single record. So what would happen is that record would flow this way as well as this way. Now I don't have my device on me right now, so I'm not going to be able to show you that a record was assigned to me. However, if I check my email, you can see I got this email that says, failed certification, please try again. Please try your certification test again. Your score is below the minimum threshold. Now, if I were to add a new record, oops. So let me fill this in manually here. And because I've memorized the answers, this is false and these are all true. So we'll say I get 100%. I submit this. I won't see that extra email coming through because it was not triggered. Additionally, for the record that I had submitted earlier, you can see that it's assigned to me here through this column inside of my data tab. Before I recap this data flow, Barrett, are there any questions?
I've been responding to most of them. Some of them are really good and specific for the data flow, but they are all responded to.
Awesome, thank you. So to recap this data flow, we begin with that webhook, just like all the other ones had, and that's where records are submitted, and then they will be caught by that webhook through that post data link. After that, inside of my record set, I use a transformation to apply an answer key to the records, and then I add in two properties for the number that were correct, as well as the total number of questions that there were. After that, I'm going to use this condition here, record.correct is divided by record.count is less than 0.75, because actions are able to have a condition set, so you'll filter which records are going to make the action execute. And then the last thing I want to make note of is that for our assign action, we were able to use the dynamic mapping to specify who the record should go to using values inside of the record. So rather than taking a username from a drop-down menu, I was able to use the record's properties to determine who would get this assigned to them. Barrett, did we want to launch that third poll?
Yep, I just launched it.
Thank you.
All right, so some folks really found this one very useful, so that is awesome to see. I'm guessing this has probably been the favorite one so far, John.
It looks that way.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and hopefully everyone has been able to get their response in for the poll, and I'll go ahead and close it and hand it back to you.
Thanks. So to recap what we went over today during this webinar, I have a couple of best practices that I wanted to share with everybody, and each one of these best practices is going to pertain to one of the particular examples that I showed you. So the first best practice we want to do is to use event objects to trigger new paths in your data flow. If we go back to that first data flow I had, I use this event object so that by sending the record into my action, that's not the end of that flow. This process has one of two outcomes, either a success or a fail. And in the event of a failure, I actually want to continue to do things. And so your event allows you to create new paths inside of the data flow and continue to have your workflow evolve. The second best practice is to always make data changes at the point of origin. So I really want to stress this again. If at all possible, you always want to make changes where the data began. So in our context, it would be data collector or an iFormBuilder. You want to try to avoid making changes downstream, because then you will have an issue where you don't know which set of data is actually correct. Our third best practice here is to use the update or insert to avoid duplicate records. If you remember when we did the second data flow, we don't want to have a new row added to our reports table every single time a record is either inserted or updated. If the record was updated, we want to make that modification to the existing row inside of our table. And so we did that using a criteria, ID is equal to ID, and that will determine if we do an update or we do an insert. This is going to, again, allow you to, even though the data flow runs multiple times, you're not going to have new rows for the same set of values each time. And then finally, the last best practice is to use conditions on action objects to filter executions. So going back to this data flow here, whoops, my mistake, this one. Our actions only execute conditionally. We only want them to execute if the user score was below a certain threshold. And so we did that by setting up our conditions on the individual action. I did that by going over to this the condition tab, and setting it down below. This way, only certain records will have this action execute based on that condition criteria that I wrote out. That's going to allow you to have actions that execute sometimes, and other times they will be skipped over. And we recommend that as a best practice so that you're able to create actions that are more user specific and that they will be able to target a specific outcome as well. Now, I do want to note that, like I said at the beginning of this webinar, and we mentioned it multiple times, I know that this can be a lot of information to take in, especially if you are brand new to Dataflows. So I do want everyone to be reassured that we are here for you all to support you in your learning process. There's a lot of different options for you. The primary one I want to point out is our Customer Success Center, which actually just got a bit of a facelift the other day. One of our colleagues here, Joe's been working really hard, and I think that it looks awesome now. This is much more user-friendly. It's very visually appealing. It's easy to go and figure out where you want to click on. But the Customer Success Center is a great place for you to go to look up articles in our knowledge base. We have a lot of articles that are going to be similar to like a tutorial that will help guide you through steps. We're also working on expanding the set of offerings for things that are going to explain concepts and topics to people as well. Also within the Customer Success Center is actually the community section. And so this is an area where you as community members are able to add posts, create topics, and discuss things revolving around iFormBuilder and Zerion Web Services. Anytime we do things like feature frenzies, we always ask people to try to post on here to get feedback from the community. That is going to be a great way for us to get information on what we can do better and the direction we want to take the software. And then the last thing I'll mention is that we always have webinars. So if you want to stay up to date with the webinars, we're going to be always posting them on ZerionSoftware.com. And then also, if you have a user inside of Zerion Academy, we have upcoming webinars posted there as well. I might as well take this point or this time to also let you know that anyone who is in attendance or who registered for this webinar will have a Zerion Academy user made for you. So you'll be able to access recordings not only of this webinar, but of previous webinars as well. And then finally, as Barrett mentioned earlier at the beginning of the webinar, we do offer certifications for form building. And I believe, Barrett, you said that the next certification was June 20th to the 22nd. Is that correct?
I believe so.
All right.
Yes, it is.
Awesome. And then the recertification I know was in August. So keep your eyes open for that. Those are a real great opportunity for you to get feedback from us and have us work with you and develop your best practices that will help you in your form building. So at this point, I just want to thank everybody for, oops, sorry to cut you off there, Barrett. I just want to thank everyone.
Was thinking, oops. I just want to make sure that we launch that final poll because I think that's a really helpful one.
Mm-hmm.
So if we could go ahead and just find out from everyone if they'd like us to reach out to them so that they can learn more about Dataflow automation, or if they feel like they've gotten enough information today. So if everyone could respond, that would be great. Again, I think this is really helpful for us to know and for us to make sure that you're successful and get you into Dataflow automation if you're interested. So I'll go ahead and close that poll, John, and before I give it to you to end the whole session, I do want to thank you for doing a great job going through Dataflow automation, and I think this was a really helpful webinar.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, and so as I was saying before, we will be doing a couple of things at the end of this webinar. The first thing is within the next 48 hours, you're going to be receiving a follow-up email. That email is going to have information for you to access Zerion Academy, as well as inside of Zerion Academy, there will be a recording of the session and then also a copy of the presentation PDF that I was using to present today. And then the last thing I want to really say is that please be sure to be on the lookout for our next webinar, which is going to be solving business problems with Zerion Web Services. That's going to be on June 15th at 11 a.m. So it's actually, I believe that's a Thursday, and it's at 11 a.m. instead of our normal Wednesday at 4 p.m. time slot. So make sure you block off that time, and hopefully we will see you then. Barrett, are there any last questions before I close this out?
No, there aren't. Thank you, John.
All right, thank you, and have a good day, everybody.